one of the key components in setting up a home lab, especially if you're testing policies and so forth as clients are going through the firewalls, is to have internet connectivity. So a big part of that in our lab environment that I've been walking through is the router that's linking our 23 network, the 23.1.2 network, out to the real live internet and providing NAT and PAT services. So in this video, I'd like to walk you through the exact steps of doing that if you're using a Cisco iOS router. If you're using Vios or Juniper or some other flavor, please feel free to follow the guidelines and steps for those. But the basic functionality we need is a router that can have .1 as its IP address on the 23.1.2 network and have routing capabilities out to the public internet and also provide NAT and PAT services for any traffic that are trying to go out to the internet through that device. So here is our game plan. This router, we're going to have gig 0/1 be .1. So it'll be reachable over this 23.1.2 network by both Palo Alto firewalls. And then on the outside interface, let's just go ahead and use DHCP because as a client, because I've already got DHCP services there. And by being a DHCP client, it can pick up an IP address as well as a default gateway, which will provide it internet connectivity. And then furthermore, what we'll need to do is set up NAT, or really what we're setting up is its little cousin PAT that says if any traffic is coming into the router, it needs to be routed out this interface, gig 00. And if it's coming from the 23 network, then go ahead and do network address translation. And we'll just basically swap out the source IP address to whatever happens to be the IP address on gig 00. And that will make this 23.1.2 network look like just one little component of the larger internet. So that way clients, as they go out to the internet, if they are successfully routed and natted through the firewall, they can continue their journey onto the live internet. And we'll call R1 just part of our infrastructure for the lab. Because once it's in place and working, we don't ever really have to go back and look at it. Because once we get our Palo Altos up and running and set up, most of our energy and time and focus is going to be all right here on these Palo Alto firewalls. And we're just going to take the internet for granted beyond that point. And setting up R1 will allow us to do exactly that. So I have powered on R1. I right-clicked and I clicked on Start to give it a few moments to come up. I'm going to go ahead and click on it. And based on this router, it's going to open up a telnet session, which it just did. And this Cisco router is asking us if we want to do the initial configuration dialog, the script. I'm going to say no, and then wait for about, I don't know, a minute or two, and then we'll do the initial bootstrapping of this Cisco iOS router. And while that's coming up, I like to keep my my initial bootstrap commands. This is VS Code. It's handy for programming. It's also handy for storing a lot of commands that you do all the time. So I'm just going to dump this in, and it's going to turn off domain lookup. It's going to turn off debugging and log timestamps. It's going to change the banner message. It's going to do logging synchronous on the VTY lines. These are a lot of just creature comforts that a lot of people do on Cisco iOS. So I'm just going to grab all that, right-click, copy it, go back here, press enter a couple times, and then right-click. And there's my config I'm about to paste in. Looks good to me. And we'll click on paste. All right, and we'll go back into configuration mode. I'll call this hostname R1. Now, all those commands I did had nothing to do with NAT and PAT. So if you did none of that, it wouldn't even matter. So now let's focus on the commands for IP addressing and port address translation for this router. And let me just peek at my topology one more time. So gig 01 is going to the 23 network, and gig 00 goes out to the internet. All right, fantastic. So let's go to interface gig 00. That's the outside interface. We'll do a no shutdown to make sure it is up. And we'll do IP address, DHCP, and that'll make it a DHCP client. Super. That interface is on its way to becoming functional. Let's go to interface gig 0/1. This is on the 23 network. We'll do a no shutdown. I just noticed we got an IP address. Fantastic. On the DHCP interface. Fantastic. So this is gig 0/1 that just came up. We'll give it an IP address of 23.1.2.1 with a 24-bit mask. And that looks good. And let's create an access control list that we can use for the benefit of using it with NAT. So let's create access list 1. We'll say anybody on the 23 anything is allowed to be translated. And to actually include that access control list as part of our NAT rule, we'll create the NAT rule, IP NAT, inside source, list number 1. That's the list we just created. And we'll bring up some context-sensitive help. Let's translate them over to the current IP address that is on interface gig 0/0. And we'll use the overload command saying, please feel free to do that thousands of times for thousands of different IP addresses. All right, and then we're going to specify on the interfaces which one is outside from a NAT perspective and which one is inside. It's kind of an older way of doing it, but it still works. So we'll go to interface gig 0/0, and we'll say IP NAT outside. And there's the trace. It's virtualized. No worries. You just panicked a little bit. If that continues, I'll address it, but I think we're going to be okay. And then we'll go to interface gig 0/1, and we'll say IP NAT inside. And then let's test it. Let's do a show IP interface brief. So we've got an outside address of that. We've got this connected to our pseudo internet. And to test this, we could do a ping to 8888. And if we want to test NAT, we do a ping to 8.8.8.8, but we can source it from this IP address. And because this inside address matches the NAT rule, it'll go ahead and translate for us. So I should have the keyword source though. Let's do that. Source. I thought it. Okay, and since that worked, we'll do a show IP NAT translations. Okay, that's working. That's our infrastructure. I think that's all we need at the moment. So let's go ahead and do a WR. Let's short for copy running config to startup config. And then check this out. There's one other thing I want to do that's really important. In our lab environment, we want to make darn sure we can get that config back up and in place if we ever need it, because we don't want to have to ever touch R1 again. We just want it to do its job. So a great way of storing that configuration persistently is by exporting it. So here in EVE-NG, we can right click on that router that's currently running. We'll click on export CFG right here. And let me show you what's happening at the console. So at the console, it's going to go ahead and basically spit out the entire running config, and it put it and stored it as part of EVE-NG. So if we go back to EVE-NG over here on the left, if we go to startup configs here, you'll notice that on R1, if we click on it, look at this, there's the full config right there. And then we can also specify that whenever it powers on, if it gets wiped and we want to bring it up, it should go ahead and use this for its startup config, which will then eventually, once it's running, be in the running config. All right, so I want to make sure we have that. So now that we have our lab environment, in the next set of videos, I'd like to walk you through the nuts and bolts of foundation networking with the Palo Altos as we boot them for the first time, initially configure them, and start our journey in the world of Palo Alto. So I'll see you in the next set of videos for those tasks as well. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.